The paper itself covers a lot of ground, so I just, I wanted to kind of come up with a few ways of looking and potential areas for discussion. I've come up with 4 altogether. But there's a wide range of themes that both define the field of childhood and beset the field of childhood, all within the paper. The overwhelming feeling I was left with on a couple of readings was the importance of the personal, the importance of how time is actually lived by children themselves and what they do with it, and how time becomes visible in particular ways. So there are certain points, biographical points, where time becomes not only visible but classifiable in certain ways. And I think that's demonstrated very, very succinctly in the paper. I was also drawn to thinking about, because it was so personal, it was illustrated by so much of the personal commentary from Harriet's own data. It also made me think about my own childhood and time as I kind of recall it. And I was thinking about, coming from a large Irish Catholic family, in my family there's a saying, everyone says it, they say it all the time, that when God made time, he made plenty of it. And this, in my family, is an explanation stroke excuse for our continued lateness for absolutely everything. And in fact, some family members have been known to arrive 24 hours late for certain events. But that leads me on to a couple of other family traits, which is also it's so imbued with time. That is that there's always time for another drink, and that punctuality is much overrated. But coming to Harriet's, so I did think that Harriet captured something of the way children are in time, the way they live in time, the way it becomes visible, but also how that is interconnected. And although she doesn't talk very much about the family because of the school-based data, I did get a sense of the time being shaped by families as well. But I just wanted to point to 4 areas of paper where I feel are particularly generative for discussion and future work. First of all, I wanted to say a few words about the key themes of the paper itself, a kind of overview of the main achievements of the paper. Then I wanted to say something about how research is located in time but also a product of its time, and how that comes through in the themes of the paper itself. Then I wanted to say something about childhood and psychoanalysis, because I feel that's a very rich area of the paper that actually doesn't really, despite the fact that it's so imbued in childhood and childhood's so central to that literature, that it doesn't make it into the canon of childhood studies very much. So I wanted to say a few words about that. Then finally I wanted to say something about childhood and loss. So I'll just kind of go through those each in turn. But thinking about the main themes of the paper, Harriet's exploring the interrelationship between childhood, temporality and development. She's commenting on the messiness of disciplinary boundaries and the tensions between disciplinary histories, traditions and different ways of looking. Embedded within the paper is the story of childhood studies itself and the story of its present incarnation, and the influence of the new sociology of childhood. But over and above this scholarly discussion of childhood and child time development, Harriet adds her own very distinctive voice. Based on her own study of young people in Norway, beginning at the age of 7, these empirical illustrations say something about how the importance of longitudinal work, how it's important not just to look but to keep looking, and things emerge over time, and that was very well demonstrated in the material that she drew on. So she's paying attention to what children do and say, but what they do and say over time, revisiting them year on year to find out how that changes or is embellished over time. So it's not just a kind of, in some ways it's a very counter model to the new sociology of childhood. It's wanting to hold on to so many things that Harriet's claiming have been bracketed out or lost from the new sociology of childhood. So Harriet's paying attention to what children do and say over time and wanting to hold on to what she's observing in those annual encounters. So the significance of biological and psychological maturation seems particularly important. the importance of cognitive development, of embodied experience, the emotional capacities, character, another really tough concept for sociologists, the achievement of gender, but also I feel a kind of main contribution of the paper is the ways in which all of these things are lived as in an integrated way. So these aren't parallel processes going on at the same time. They're actually interwoven and interrelated. And I think that's a real contribution to the way of looking at the child and childhood, to see these processes as working through the individual, the peer group, and social relations in a very integrated way. So this isn't just about the child and development, it's also about the child in the social sphere, their relationships and their cultural practices. Now to move on to say something about how research is both located in time and a product of time, I think there are many examples of that in the paper itself. I suppose research is always a response to something else. It's always a response to whatever's gone before. So it's a response that gives. So all research has a certain place in time, a timing that's sometimes very identifiable, sometimes a timeliness that defines its place. And this is amply illustrated in the studies referred to in the paper. So one of the early things that Harriet refers to is the OPs. And of course, the OPs work can be seen as a kind of butterfly catching approach to childhood, and particularly to documenting childhood and folklore, children's folklore. The mythical past and present, as it's referred to in the paper, suggested by James and Prout. But it can also be seen as a product of its time, in that it can be seen as a response to post-war culture. It can be seen as a response to the seemingly what can seem to be the loss of childhood in the wake of the Second World War, where during that wartime it was felt that children lost their innocence. Urban children were evacuated out into the countryside. There's a bombing of urban spaces, and there's also great change in morality generally, and a change in family forms. So all of that, it could be seen that the OP's work is an attempt to capture something that's been lost in the wake of those world events. But the new sociology of childhood is also important to see that as both of its time and a product of its time. And Harriet talks about how it's it comes at a particular confluence, and I think it's useful to see it as an academic intervention. So a new sociology of childhood comes along at a particular time when it's surveying sociological and psychological ways of doing things. It looks at the tensions between those two things, and they're seen as kind of they're both seen as inadequate. They're both seen in some ways. So in kind of knocking down all the binaries that the new sociology of childhood comes along with a new approach. And the two defining features of the approach is that childhood is a social construction and children are social actors. And in order to kind of make these the gem of that new way of looking, that involves the knocking down of particularly sociological and psychological ways of looking, but particularly the idea of development. So it's the idea of development that gets lost in that reformulation of that academic intervention. So Harriet demonstrates very well not just the significance of the new sociology of childhood, but the way it comes along at a particular historical moment, defines itself, and in defining itself critiques a lot of binaries, knocks a lot down, but actually recreates some more. So I think it's very, very, very insightful. It's in fact insightfully encapsulated and embedded within the paper itself. And then a couple of other examples of research being a product of time and located in time. When Harriet talks about post-structuralist literature, as discussed in the paper, she talks about the ahistorical approach, particularly of Butler. And that can also be seen as, located in time, because, in many ways, Butler's commenting. She's actually in dialogue with and commenting on Foucault's work, which, of course, was and is historical. So that idea of research and time, I think, comes through in the paper that very, very strongly that research itself is timely. It comes along at a particular time, it defines itself in time, and it's a response to things that have gone before. Now, to say just a few words about childhood and psychoanalysis, I feel that this is a really rich area of the paper, and one that's got a lot to contribute to the field much more generally. So it's a really interesting feature of the paper that's commentary on psychoanalytic theory, and very suggestive about the ways it can inform the study of children and childhood. So if we take into account the unconscious dimensions, it really does. Well, my first thought was that it really exposed it in a way the woeful literal interpretation of being and becoming in the new sociology of childhood, which is a bit of a naughty thought, but I couldn't help thinking it. It's kind of like if you think of multiple temporalities, you just think the new sociology of childhood is really kind of just quite inadequate response to that. But the paper also, Harriet's concern is to retain the concept of development in a way that's useful, in a way that's productive, and in a way that's very generative. So when she talks about development, she's also talking about the development of subjectivity. So the unconscious and psychoanalytic theory is informing her concept of development, and I think that's a really significant approach. So the paper demonstrates the significance of development as a positive and very multifaceted force, present and necessary for the growth and well-being of children. So interestingly, we see examples of this at work in the peer group and in the individual children over time. So as Harriet very succinctly puts it, emotional energy and relational conflict seem to drive development. Now, I feel that this is a kind of rich area that could go on being commented upon, and it would be really nice if that made its way into the childhood studies canon, because it seems to be kind of on the fringes of it at the moment. And other things I thought about, how Lacanian ideas, Lacanian theory, child very central to those ways of looking, particularly the pre-linguistic child, language being a very definer of childhood experience in that model, how that could also help shape that way of looking and be very generative to future analyses. And then the final theme is the theme of childhood and loss. And here, this isn't something that, although it's in the paper and Harriet comments on it, I think in this respect, I'm extrapolating this theme from the paper and pulling out where childhood and loss gets talked about. So it's kind of not addressed specifically in its own terms by Harriet. But the thing that I'd say is that there's actually a lot of loss in the paper. Loss is a real kind of feature of many aspects of the paper. And of course, loss is in itself a temporally defined concept. It seems like it's imbued with a sense of time. So just to look at what's where loss appears in the paper. First of all, what seems to be lost in the new sociology of childhood, there's much dwelling on that, and of course the big loss is temporality itself, developmental psychology and relationships with the social world. So the arrow of time idea also, the idea of irreversibility, that's also about loss in some ways, it could be interpreted. And then when Harriet's talking about Astrid, who she conjures up very vividly, there's a loss of girlhood in Astrid's account, a loss of the gender equality that defined her pre-teen years, and that in becoming a teenager, she loses her girlhood. And there are many other accounts of loss of girlhood in other literature, of course. So I'm not sure where quite I'm going with childhood and loss, except to say that, when I was thinking about how much it's talked about in childhood studies, not just in this paper but generally, I feel that loss is probably as much a bigger theme as the idea of children as social actors, but it's kind of like just kind of weaves in and out. It's not treated as a significant theme in itself necessarily. But just to finish with a couple of points, and these are two losses of my own. I'm just kind of adding on to what Harriet's saying. I feel that one of the things that I feel is kind of becoming like marginal or kind of existing on the margins of childhood studies is the power of literary approaches to childhood and the power of literature to actually say something and conjure up childhood and comment on childhood in particularly interesting and vivid ways. So when you, I don't just mean novels, but works of memoir as well, and the richness of childhood experience as conjured up in the literary world and the representational world, I feel like that could be, I feel there's much more work to be done to actually integrate that into accounts of childhood, and if we see it as an interdisciplinary field, to have literary accounts that work with sociological and psychological accounts. Then I suppose the other point I just wanted to raise, and this is kind of another, just a personal sense of where loss is coming in, is just to say something about the social reality of children's lives, and to say something that, running counter to the burgeoning of childhood studies and the interest in childhood studies as a field, there's actually another tendency, and that is that in the UK and many other countries, particularly in the global north, childhood, there's a deep ambivalence about childhood. There's this kind of idea that childhood is deeply ambivalent and doesn't have a secure place in the culture as something that's kind of, as a temporal time of life that's revered and respected. And if we think about, the cuts in children's services, in social care, the low pay and often low status of people who actually work with children, then I think there is another narrative there to be told that's running counter to the actual burgeoning of academic work in the field. So on that final, somewhat gloomy note, I'll leave it there.